Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your interest in this webinar. And thank you, Joe, for introducing me. Unfortunately, as you might have heard, we have a technical issue here, so I am just moving my head from side to side because the camera is here, but the monitor is not working anymore, and I have to look always into the actual monitor over there. So please excuse me for this wrong watching all the time or all the time looking from one side to the other side. I will try to concentrate to look into the camera, although I don't see the slide actually. So if there is any further question, by the way, please let us know. We are happy to discuss with you. Yeah, what is this webinar about? So in this webinar, we will look at some of the cybersecurity requirements in medical devices and how you can achieve compliance with those requirements. And the presentation itself is actually organized by 3 sections. So basically, we'll look at the why for cybersecurity and who are the key players in the market, especially the regulators. And last but not least, how can we achieve or can you achieve compliance to the respective cybersecurity requirements? So I will skip, change the slide. Hopefully that works. Good. I think the most important question that I would ask myself if I was a manufacturer would be if and why cybersecurity needs to be considered in a medical device. And to understand and answer this question, we need to look into the current state of the medical device industry. And we also need to understand how the market will evolve within the next few years. And if we look into the healthcare industry in general, we see more and more medical devices being connected either to each other or to the hospital network or to the patient's smartphone or even to the internet. Today, approximately 25%, so 1 of 4 medical devices is connected. Is a connected medical device. And the number of connected medical devices is supposed to rise to more than 70% just within the next few years. And with increasing number of connected medical devices, we also see an increased number of cyber attacks because you are increasing this attack surface of a medical device. And the motivation from the bad guys could be either to access your sensitive patient healthcare data or to harm a patient or to use a compromised device to enter the hospital network or even to lock up the medical device for ransom, which have been done with many ransomwares within the last few years. So if we stay with the ransom and the economic risk, the global cost of cybercrime is estimated to be 500 billion euros per year. And the number of those attacks, as well as the potential of those attacks, are increasing year by year. And in some cases, even outstripping the government's potential to deal with it. Example for that was the European Medicines Agency just a few months ago, where information on the coronavirus, as well as on patient data, had been stolen, or the attack on the Irish healthcare system provider a few weeks ago that forced the healthcare department to shut down their whole IT infrastructure. So something that I hear very often when I discuss with manufacturers is that they say medical device industry is more or less cyber secure, which is not wrong. It's correct, actually. However, the statement that you hear very often that who would dare to attack the healthcare industry and risk innocent lives is not really true, because it is already happening, as I explained to you before. And a recent study done by the Global Connected Industry shows that over 80% of all medical device manufacturers they have been questioning has experienced at least one cyber attack within the last 12 months. And that study is from 2020. And the interesting part of the information is that 30% of those attacks had the potential to harm a patient if it was at the operator side. And let me change to the next slide. And if we look at the past few years, there have been already quite a lot of attacks or vulnerabilities identified in medical device. I think one of the first major example was an FDA advisory notice where the FDA was explicitly and strongly advising healthcare providers to stop using Hospira infusion pumps. And this is very interesting because it was not only a cybersecurity warning, the FDA explicitly asked hospitals not to use the Hospira infusion pumps. And now imagine your company name being in such a FDA advisory. There is not only a financial damage due to incident response, you might have to perform field safety corrective actions. It's not only the financial part or the market removal that you have to do, but also it's an issue of reputation and loss of trust, which is especially concerning for larger companies. So if you look into the next one from 2018, the DHS has issued an advisory warning on Alari syringe pumps that allow an attacker to change the drug dosage applied to the patient, and by this may be applying a lethal dosage to the patient. Basically, the device was missing any kind of authentication for remote connection. And the interesting part here is that the vulnerability was actually possible because someone has decided to bring the pump into the hospital network, although the device was not intended to be connected. So as the message here is, by bringing the device that is not intended to be connected to the network into the hospital network, you are bringing new attack vectors and attack surfaces that is applied to the medical device. So you need to have foreseeable misuse in your back of your mind. So if you look into the last year or 2019, there was an interesting vulnerability identified by FDA, which where the FDA has issued a safety communication on a software component. VxWorks is the name of it, and this was very often used in medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices. The vulnerability actually could allow hackers to remotely control a medical device. And the interesting part here is that the devices where this software component was incorporated were developed taking into account cybersecurity measures. However, the time passes, new vulnerabilities have been identified in this software component that opens doors to new attack vectors. The learning here should be actually that even if your device is secure on a point of release, it doesn't mean it will be secure over the few years that the device is being used in a market. So post-market activities in regard to cybersecurity are necessary, and you need to consider it in your development lifecycle. And I think at the end of the time, if I was a manufacturer, I have two major objectives. First, do not kill your patient. Well, that's clear. And second, do not land on a wall of shame of medical industry. And as we see from the last example, cybersecurity issues are tracked in those databases. What you should always consider is that for the media, cybersecurity issues are mostly high-profile affairs, especially for larger companies. And the reputational damage and loss of trust into the brand is significant for those companies. So, and what loss of trust means, we see, for instance, for the company Hospira, the first example I explained to you, that company does not exist anymore. And I think that one, should be more or less similar to the majority of the audience. The WannaCry, Petya, and non-Petya ransomware attacks, which basically only affects the medical device sector. The vulnerability was patched by Microsoft before the ransom was seen actually in a while. However, the patch was only provided to support a version of Windows, which some of the medical device manufacturers and operators basically was not using at that time. By the way, the first wave of WannaCry leads to 19,000 appointments being changed on NHS hospitals. So on that time, many other verticals, such as the banking sector, was actually not affected. And if you remember, the media started to complain or state that it is rather ironic that money seemed to need more security than patients. However, this statement is not really fair. And there are, of course, a reason for that. And one of them is a highly regulated medical field. And of course, a pace of innovation and change that is possible in a medical device regulated field. You can't just move completely new operation system just within a short period of time. However, at the same time, using operation systems several years after the end of support of the operation system might be a little bit too long. So there is always a truth in this statement. One additional example I would like to show you is a cyber attack on a hospital in Düsseldorf, Germany in 2020, so last year, where the emergency department wasn't able to treat a patient due to an encryption of the IT infrastructure. And for this reason, the patient must be redirected to a 30-kilometer away hospital in Wuppertal, which delayed the patient's treatment by approximately 1 hour. And unfortunately, the patient died shortly after arriving in the next hospital. And the interesting part of the information here is, and you should keep it in your mind, is that the prosecutor of the city of Cologne stated that they are not only preparing charges against the hackers, but also against the hospital IT staff and the manufacturer of the affected devices. So it is not only a reputational damage, it is not only a financial damage, you do also have legal issues you need to consider. So as I explained before at the beginning of the slide, it's not only about hacking a device to harm a patient or ask for ransom, but also our healthcare information is at stake. I would argue there is no information more private than our healthcare information, right? So if your credit card number gets stolen, well, you just get a new one. But what do you do if your healthcare information being leaked? So just imagine what information you have stored in your healthcare data. For instance, you have diseases or you take some drugs that you don't want anyone else to know. And at the same time, the amount of data that is stored in our database are increasing rapidly. Just within the last 7 years, we have an increase 1,500% in healthcare data. And this is exactly what the attackers are actually looking for. And they are already targeting them. The most famous example, was I'm sorry, someone just called me over Teams. I need to finish this one. So one famous example was the attack on the Singaporean largest hospital in 2019 or 18, if I remember correctly, where the healthcare information of the newly elected Singaporean Prime Minister was repeatedly attacked, and his healthcare information and drugs he was taking were explicitly stolen for whatever reason. Who knows? And the last example, and I will go into the real topic of this presentation, that is worth really to mention is the world appetite for digital healthcare. Not only since Corona pandemic, digital health and telemedicine is a hot topic in the medical industry. And despite of the increasing number of health apps you do have in a respective app stores or standalone software you can install on your PCs, the majority of the patients do not want to use them. And the main factor for not using health apps are, according to a report that has been published by Incisive Health, are data privacy and security concerns. And the concerns of these patients or potential clients are for good reason, as we have seen from the recent examples. And they are not really a medical device. However, those contact tracing has their own issues with cybersecurity. For instance, the first version of the North Dakota contact tracing app sends the GPS data they use for the contact tracing, not only for tracing contacted COVID patients, but also they send it directly to Foursquare, which is basically similar to Facebook. So basically Foursquare knows where you have been, who you have contacted during the daily walks you have done. I think that's enough for the past. So now let's have a look at some of the major pain points of the manufacturers when it comes to cybersecurity and how we can maybe solve those issues. What we can see in general from what we have discussed so far is there is an increased awareness of the regulators for cybersecurity in medical devices or in vitro diagnostics. So whatever I explained to you on medical devices is on the same level applicable to in vitro diagnostics. And it's not only Europe, but globally, we have seen an increased awareness of the regulators for cybersecurity and increased number of guidance on regulations being published by the regulators. And here we see an evolution of cybersecurity guidance and regulation worldwide. And as we can see from the number of guidance documents and the regulation being published, the awareness has definitely increased within the last few years. And compared to the last 16 years, the majority of documents have been published just within the last 2 years. So if you look at 2005, 2020, the majority of them are basically from 2019. So regulators have an eye on cybersecurity in the healthcare sector, and they are setting our framework for our medical device. So we need to consider that. And let me give you one last example of this increase awareness, if we look, for instance, for the European regulators, we see how over the year their requirements on cybersecurity have changed. While the old directive, MDD and IVDD, only mentions cybersecurity just indirectly, the MDR and IVDR already defines 6 safety and performance requirements for cybersecurity each. And the respective guidance document from MDCG 2 years later already lists 47 pages of cybersecurity. And at the end of the time, in simple words, the regulatory framework for medical devices require a cybersecure medical device, and ignoring cybersecurity is not an option anymore. A cybersecure medical device is actually one of the very many requirements to gain access to the respective markets. Without cybersecurity, you do not get access to the market. This is not only applicable to Europe, but also applicable to all the major regulators and markets worldwide. And there is not only the medical device regulation, you do also have horizontal regulations that define additional requirements on the security of a device. For instance, we do have the GDPR, so the data protection regulation, and what you should always consider is that in case of privacy incidences, the fine that can be forced on you are quite significant. Just for GDPR, the fines can be up to 4% of your yearly revenue. So it's quite a huge number. So now let's have a look at the major pain points of the medical device industry when it comes to cybersecurity. And one of the many complaints that I heard when I discussed with the manufacturers is the question on what should we actually do? Or let me put it in statements of management, how can we achieve compliance with the cybersecurity requirements? Which standards should we use? Which country-specific requirements should be met? Because they are additionally to the global requirements, to the European requirements, you do also have local, regional requirements that you might need to fulfill. And other questions are, should we go for infrastructure cybersecurity? So is ISO 27000 series of standard necessary? Or for US, is high trust mandatory? One other question is, how about a cybersecurity lifecycle process? So what is the best practice there? And I agree with you, the situation is really confusing. So let's try to bring some order into this small mess. So here we see, by the way, an overview of the standard and regulations that are currently applicable to the European market. We do have the medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation with high level requirements that are mandatory because they represent the law. Those high level requirements are first explained in MDCG guidance documents, and the MDCG guidance documents are not mandatory. However, as it is with FDA guidance documents, deviating from the interpretation need a justified explanation. The security risk management process, which was recently updated in 2019, is core part of a development lifecycle of a medical device, and there you need to consider risks that are associated with the medical device. The update in 2019 also include risk associated with data security, data privacy, and cybersecurity. And the authors of the standard go as far as to explain that there is no separate process necessary for the management of security risk in medical devices. So basically, you can stick with this risk management process 4971, and you should also be able to consider cybersecurity risk. Good. Unfortunately, there is many other guidance documents and regulations and standards available. So let me quickly list one of the many, or one of the, or few of the many examples. So very interesting one is, of course, a newly published technical report for medical device cybersecurity, the ICTR 6601-4-5. Unfortunately, this standard does not apply to in vitro diagnostic devices, but apply to all medical devices, including standalone software. So software as a medical device is applicable. And this TR has a high probability of being the product standard of choice when it comes to medical device cybersecurity. So please keep a good eye on this one. And by the way, it's actually a good standard. There are good and bad, and this one is actually a quite pragmatic standard. The 62443 is actually not for the healthcare sector. However, many other standards are copying from this series of standard. The 60601-45 is also copying from this series. And the reason for that is the 62443 is an industry accepted standard when it comes to cybersecurity. So definitely worth having an eye on this one to understand how the future medical device cybersecurity framework will evolve in the future. And the other one I would like to also mention here, although not really an international standard and focus on US market, but definitely a must read are the standards from AAMI and especially TIR 57, which deals with cybersecurity risk management process. There's also the upcoming cybersecurity process standard 81001-5-1, which is supposed to be published hopefully within the next few months. So definitely this year. Also, this one has a high chance of being the software lifecycle process standard for the healthcare industry. So please keep a good eye on this one as well. Yeah, I think that's enough for regulation guidance standards. Now let's have a look, or let's try to identify how you can achieve compliance with those respective regulation guidance documents. However, in this short, we will only concentrate some of the major common issues. So please feel free to contact us afterwards for additional questions. Of course, everything I explained to you here, we can provide by our test house services. So let's have a look. What is actually the regulators requiring for you for the European market? And as part of the procedure for a medical device or in vitro diagnostic device to be placed on the market, you need to show compliance to the general safety and performance requirements, and these requirements are defined in Annex 1 of the respective regulations. The requirements defined in Annex 1 also consider cybersecurity requirements. For instance, you need to develop the software considering IT security, and you are required to implement measures against security issues such as unauthorized access. In addition to that, you must inform the user about residual cybersecurity risks. That could be, for instance, any unresolved vulnerability. You must provide information to the user in your instruction for use on how to securely set up the device. Those information are, for instance, IT network characteristics or open or closed ports and so on and so on. And as it is always the case with laws, these requirements are very general and very broadly defined. So you need to look into the MDCG guidance document to further understand how you can show compliance with those. So in a nutshell, basically the risk or the MDCG guidance defines that cybersecurity risk management process is an integral part of the security of a medical device. And cybersecurity risk management process is supposed to be performed and implemented throughout the whole life cycle of a medical device. The life cycle starts with the first idea of the device and includes a post-market phase. And this is very important, sometimes forgotten, also includes the removal of the device from the market. We might discuss about that later on in the discussion. So what does it mean actually? So the MDCG guidance explains that no separate security risk management process is necessary, and you can implement the security risk management as part of your general safety risk management process, which you definitely have in place already as a medical device manufacturer. But how do you implement cybersecurity in your common risk management process? The guidance explains it in a complicated form, but actually it's quite easy. So for each risk management process step, you need to have one corresponding risk management step. I'm sorry, for each safety risk management step, you need to have one corresponding security risk management step. And this is shown actually in a graph on the left side of the slide. However, you do have influences between the two security steps. So you have security issues and safety issues, and they might influence each other. For instance, security measure such as a login window might lead to a safety risk, such as device not being available when the password is lost. So you cannot treat the patient. So if you have a strong password where the doctor needs 3 hours to write the password and get the 2-factor authentication password to get access to the device, a patient might already die. So in that case, you have influences between security measures and safety measures. And as with always with medical devices, safety is the one that is more important for the patient. You don't want to kill the patient. That's the thing you should always consider. And as I explained to you, it's quite straightforward, not very complicated, just complicatedly defined in a guidance document. So you just need to take your normal safety risk management process, add cybersecurity to each of the steps, and you're good to go. By the way, this graph is copied from the MDCG guidance document. However, there is a mistake in the graph. The influence between the post-market process and the security risk management is missing. If you want to see the correct one, you might want to look in TIR 57 standard form AAMI. There you find the correct. Since we are talking about AAMI, for US market, we do have the FDA guidance document for post-market and pre-market requirements, which are not only for US market, they're must read. They are actually quite good guidance document for cybersecurity. And you also have the FDA guidance for called, no, I don't have it here. So you do have additional guidance from FDA. It's on the shelf software and connected medical devices, if I remember correctly, which I highly recommend to read as well, even if you are not focused in the US market. However, a good guidance on how to deal with soup components in your device. And the next thing is, or next major part of your security risk management and security lifecycle process is also defined in the GDPR, so General Safety and Performance Requirement, Annex 1 of the regulations. Both regulations require from you a software lifecycle process. And the MDCG guidance further expands this requirement to a security lifecycle process. And with this one, the manufacturer, from my experience, have sometimes issues how to implement that. And basically, you have for the security lifecycle process several approaches. You can either go the international standard route. For instance, you can use the upcoming 81001-5-1. There are other non-medical lifecycle standards you might want to use. There is also the option to go, for instance, with Microsoft Secure Development Cycle lifecycle. So SDL is actually quite good. Although Microsoft has its own issues with security in the past, it is also one of the manufacturers currently investing most in cybersecurity. And one of the output of their reports is the secure lifecycle practice, which is available for free, and it's actually a good guidance on how to develop a secure software, not concentrating on medical devices, however, still worth looking into that one. And the question, how do you implement security requirements into your conventional software lifecycle process? Well, you basically do the same as we have done before. It is explained very complicated in a guidance document and in SDL. However, it's quite easy. You basically take your conventional software lifecycle process, which is usually done performing according to 62304, and you add security activities to each of the lifecycle activities. Sounds easy, and it actually is very easy. So let's see how does it work. Let me check the time. Ooh, okay, I should be. So I will reduce the explanation a little bit. So, as a standard and also secure lifecycle process, explain in more detail how you can add security activities in your software lifecycle process. And one integral part of the approach is to add risk management to each of the development steps. And then you apply threat modeling whenever you identify issues, right? For instance, you identify issues in your maintenance process, you have a software maintenance process, and you identify some issues. Now that information needs to be inputted into a threat model, and the result of the threat model analysis, you need to take this information and pass it backwards through the whole development process to earlier stage. So let me explain it to you one more time. So the development process flow forward, but the information from your threat model must flow backwards. Why? Because you need to bring this information to your earlier point, to the starting point, so you can develop the next iteration, taking into account the result of your threat modeling. And the question, the next question would be, how do you perform threat modeling and what approach does exist? So I will try to keep this as short as possible. So there are many possibilities to perform threat modeling, and one of the ways to do that is using Stride, which is, by the way, also a Microsoft developed approach. What is threat modeling in general? It means systematic approach to identify threats that might potentially apply to your product. And you have many ways, and one of them is Stride. And the reason why I'm mentioning Stride here is because you can easily integrate your Stride analysis in your FMEA. And FMEA usually is very often used by medical device manufacturers. And Stride is actually an abbreviation. It actually stands for checking all of your protection goals against 6 different potential violations. So these are potential. That doesn't mean they apply to your product. This is part of your assessment. And these violations are spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. I don't go into the explanation what each of these Stride components mean. So if you have any question, please let us know. How do you perform usually Stride? So let's try it with one example quickly. So the item we want to protect, which is called our asset. Asset is something we want to protect, for instance, our patient health data. And in this case, the asset we want to protect is our medical device setting. So we have an insulin pump, and we want the device to provide 1 milliliter of insulin every day to the patient. And this is an asset because we want to protect it. We don't want anyone to increase that level to a level that kills the patient. So, and the attack vector that we want to use, or the vulnerability we want to use, is a Bluetooth connection. So now what we do is we apply all of the 6 Stride violations, which I explained to you before, such as tampering, and we check if it's applied to the medical device, and if it applies, what is the effect. So the threat, which was tampering, could be, for instance, stopping the function of the device, or change, for instance, the flow rate by changing some bit in a memory of the medical device, right? So I don't want to go into too technical. So the threat is changing the medical device settings. And in a normal case, you do all the other Stride components, not only tampering, with all the other Stride components, and then you check if those components apply to your device. So we will not go to all the typical threats here. So let me go to the next slide. And here, the next step is you need to identify how easy it is to use this vulnerability. So your vulnerability, the vulnerability you're using is a Bluetooth connection, and I'm sorry, the attack vector is a Bluetooth connection, and you use the Stride tampering, and the threat is stopping the device or changing some values, so you apply more or less insulin to the patient. And usually when you perform your normal risk management process, you check the probability of occurrence of harm. You know it from your conventional safety risk management. However, for cybersecurity, we use another measure, which is how easy it is to use this vulnerability. And this is called exploitability. And in this case, we identify that the vulnerability is easy to use. So we give it some random values like 1, and the combination of the exploitabilities, that means how easy it is to use that vulnerability, and the severity, which is death, we come up to the solution, well, that's not acceptable, right? So you as a manufacturer, you need to identify if this risk is acceptable for you or not. And in this case, we, for example, we say, well, death by changing the device setting is not acceptable, and we need to do something against it. By the way, you are not supposed to use anything that we are explaining to you here. You can also use a CVSS or whatever you want. as a MITRE organization, have, by the way, published medical device CVSS, which consider also the safety of medical device. So it's up to you. Good, and as we don't accept the risk, we need to do something against this. So we need to mitigate the risk. And in this case, we identify several mitigation measures, such as limiting the possible functions that can be changed by the Bluetooth connection. And now we need to check what is the effect of our mitigation measure. Does it change the risk? And then we decide, well, by introducing our mitigation measure, usually the severity will not change. The vulnerability is still, if it's still exploitable, that would still lead to the same severity, which is death. So severity usually doesn't change. However, by implementing authentication and reducing the functionalities that can be controlled via Bluetooth, the ability to exploit the vulnerability gets more difficult. And by this mitigation, we have reduced the risk to an acceptable level. And the last step is we need to check if the implementation was effective or not. And this is one major part of your risk management process. You need to identify, was it effective or not? And this is part of the verification of validation step. And the primary way to validate those security mitigation measures are, for instance, penetration tests, fuzz testing, vulnerability scanning, and those objective evidences and documentation on tests you have done must be part of your technical documentation that you provide to the notified body to assess, or in case of US, you provide it to the regulators to evaluate it. And this is also defined in Chapter 7 of the NDCD guidance document, where it states the primary way of means of security verification and validation is testing. So you need to provide those objective evidences, including your risk management process, to the regulators. And yeah, I think that's enough for today. Let me check the time. We're perfectly in time. So let me quickly summarize the today talk. In broad picture, cybersecurity requirements in medical devices are necessary and requested by regulators. However, it's a sometimes confusing situation with many standards and guidance, and so on. Make it not really easy for the manufacturers, especially those regional requirements, such as the one from Germany and France, where additional, sometimes not aligned requirements are defined. However, in those cases, please feel free to contact us. We have security and regulatory expert for medical devices in-house, and we are also, of course, happy to get into discussion regarding security process requirements according to best practices and international standards or regulatory requirements. And of course, we do offer security testing from our medical security experts. What we didn't, unfortunately, discuss so far are the newly discovered security issues in medical devices incorporating artificial intelligence. Unfortunately, the situation there is quite complicated, with not published guidance or standards or regulation in place so far. So the US has come up with a proposed regulation. Also, the EU has published a few weeks ago a draft regulation or proposed regulation. However, they are not in place yet. And depending on the AI regulations, the effect of security issues can be significant, to be named, especially as adversarial policy attacks that sometimes can lead to disasters. And we are already getting notified on issues or incidences with AI systems in medical sector being attacked. So that's basically all from my side. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm happy to get into discussion with you.
Okay, Abtin, thank you very much for that. I mean, I think one of the key takeaways that I take from this, really, having been involved in cybersecurity of IoT devices where it might be a doorbell or a camera, that some of the consequences could be, all those privacy could be invaded. Some of the consequences are more of an annoyance, where clearly with some of the medical devices, the consequences are much more severe. So I think the importance of medical cybersecurity in those devices should be taken very, very seriously. And we've got a few questions, and I've got a question of my own, which I'll throw in at the end. But I'll just go through these questions and put them to you, see what what you can provide. So the first one is, when will the final version of IEC TR 60601-4-5 2021 be released?
Oh, it's actually have been released already. If I'm not wrong, it was somewhere in February or March, so quite a while already being published, and it's available on the IEC platform to download. And yeah, please have a look on that one. That's quite a good and pragmatic standard for medical devices. Of course, it's a product standard, not a process standard, and unfortunately not applicable to in vitro diagnostics. But it is applicable to software as well as hardware medical devices. So usually 60601 series of standard does not apply to software. However, the scope of the 60601-4-5 is including also software.
Excellent, thank you. So next question, why do we need additional standards and requirements for medical cybersecurity? Why can't we stay with the standards for industrial cybersecurity?
Well, that's actually a quite good question, because I actually partly agree with it. However, the reason why industrial cybersecurity standard and regulation might not apply to the medical sector is shown to you, or I explained to you in one example. For instance, if you have give me 1 second, I need to close the door. So, for instance, you do have a defibrillator, right? So the patient is dying, and the last hope is to take the defibrillator and shock the patient to save him from dying, right? So if you look into industrial standards, they would say, well, the patient health information and privacy is very important, so the defibrillator should have a two-factor authentication and a password which consists of symbols and characters and numbers. And until the doctor or the person helping or using the defibrillator opens the device and access it and can apply a shock, the patient might already die. So the difference between industrial and medical device sector is, in medical device sector, you do also have the safety to be gone. Not only security of the device is important, also the safety. And this is very often contrary to security requirements. For instance, in that case, you don't care if the patient healthcare data have been stolen, or you can maybe read the name of the patient from the defibrillator, because the patient is going to die anyway. So in that case, it's not, you don't care about security, but rather look into safety. So that's why you need additional medical device safety requirements considered while securing a device. This is the reason you cannot use industrial standards for medical devices in all cases. It doesn't mean that's never possible.
Okay, great. Okay, third question: are these cybersecurity requirements also applicable to health apps and not just to medical devices?
So we are currently, so this is again a good question, as with always questions. I almost always say good question, so sorry for that. So basically you do have two areas. You have the medical device market. This is highly regulated, and what you need to ensure and provide as part of your development documentations and documentation actions. Not only the documentation is ready, so notified bodies tend to talk about documentation, but you need the implementation or the important parts, and your objective evidence is the documentation. So in a regulated market, you have requirements of cybersecurity. So for instance, you have MDR asking you to have IT cybersecurity requirements considered during your development. You need to have a security lifecycle process. You need to ensure the device is does not allow someone to access the device without authorization. You have requirements for data privacy. Basically, MDR, there is, I think it's Article 100 something, if I'm not wrong. They refer to the previous version of GDPR. So you do have requirements for cybersecurity, you do have requirements for IT security, you do have requirements in MDR for data privacy, and you must show compliance to those requirements. Otherwise, you cannot gain access to the market. However, as part of your auditing and technical documentation, if you are QA to B medical device, usually you do not run through all the requirements. You sample, and one day they might identify, well, there's something not wrong, perfectly fine with the cybersecurity requirement or your objective evidence for cybersecurity implementation. Then you will get a non-conformity, for then you need to solve it. However, it is always the worst scenario to react on a non-conformity, because then you have some time requirements when you have to finish with that implementation. Usually that does lead to closing the non-conformity, but not closing the issue, because you usually go a quick and dirty solution. My suggestion is always to consider it at the beginning as early as possible, so you have an approach that satisfies your needs and not closing the non-conformity. So this is for medical devices. For health apps that are not considered to be medical devices, the situation is different. There you do not have medical device requirement because they are not medical devices. If something is not a medical device, then it's not falling within the medical device regulation. However, even with health apps, you do have requirement for cybersecurity. So GDPR, a horizontal requirement, it applies to you. The upcoming AI regulation from EU is a horizontal requirement, applies to health apps as well. And there you find requirements for cybersecurity. And also, if you provide these health apps, for instance, in Germany, the health apps must have cybersecurity requirements fulfilled, and the requirements are defined in BSI, which stands for Bundesanstalt für Information. I don't even know what this stands for, but it's a German agency for cybersecurity, and they do have published a guidance document and requirements document for those health apps. The same goes for France. For UK, I'm not sure, but the guidance provided does apply only to medical devices. So health apps could also be non-medical devices. In Germany, those health apps can only be listed to be paid by the insurance company only if they are medical devices. Then you have cybersecurity applied to it anyway. So question is difficult to answer. But yes, almost in any case, you can't circumvent it. Medical device must fulfill cybersecurity requirements, and horizontal requirements require cybersecurity implementation, even in non-medical device software.
Okay, we have another question here. It says, is it recommended to add category exploitness or vulnerability as a standard risk to assess? I'm assuming that means, when they're doing the risk assessment, is the exploitness, I think we call it exploitivity. I think or exploitability is the word you use. I mean, how does one define how they would apply the parts of a risk assessment?
I think I understand the question. Please add further questions if I understand it wrongly. So let me quickly jump to that slide here. So basically, the exploitability is not a risk, right? A risk is always a combination of the severity and exploitability, right? Every threat or every attack has a specific exploitability, right? Usually we medical device guys refer to probability of harm. So this exploitability is not a risk by itself. It applies to all risks. It is a property of all risks. So for instance, you do have stopping the therapy, which is a threat. Killing a patient is a threat. And the exploitability means how easy it is to use a vulnerability to achieve the effect, which is death. So in that case, it's not a risk that you should consider, rather than it's a characteristic of each of the risks. And each risk is a combination of severity, so death, cut his hand, I don't know, have, I don't know, head edge, and ability to exploit. These two values give the risk. So if you multiply ability times the severity, you get the risk. And as I explained to you here, I have one written here. That doesn't mean you need to use this one. You can use whatever you want. I hope I got it correct. If not, please let me know.
I think that's what the purpose of the question was. I have another question here for SAMD companies. Is it expected that ISO 27001 will be mandatory to ensure a certain level of cybersecurity?
Okay, that question is difficult to answer without knowing what your software as a medical device is, right? So if you have a software as a medical device which is installed on a PC without internet access, ISO 27000 might be a little bit too much, because 27000 is IT infrastructure cybersecurity. So it depends it depends on the intended use of a medical device. If you have, for instance, I don't know, a medical software as a medical device, as a web app which run in a cloud, then IT 27000 might apply to you. But again, standards are not mandatory. So the MDR tells you need to fulfill or show compliance to the respective requirements in Annex 1, which are these general safety and performance requirements. And you can show compliance to the requirements by using standard, but standards are not a must. It's a free for you to use it. So there is no must in using standard, and there is no must to have IT or your IT environment for medical device being certified if it's not part of the medical device. However, you might have the risk that someone attacks your IT infrastructure and add a malware into your medical device. So that means you need to ensure that your IT is safe and you do not include a malware or whatever in your medical device that might harm the patient. At the same time, that requirements apply to you. However, standards are not a must, and ISO 27000 is not always applicable to you. It depends on the intended use and intended environment, of course. Usually, that's more applied to operators, and yeah, I don't want to go into details. So we need to know what the software as a medical device is doing.
Great, thank you. I have one last question, and this is kind of a question from me because I get asked this from an IoT device perspective, and it's about, I know this is a difficult one, so I apologize if it's put you on the spot. But what about companies and their liability insurance? You know, when we are doing, or our customers are doing risk assessments and doing testing, what's your thoughts or your understanding of what the insurance industry are doing to sort of minimize any sort of payouts that they do, and also encouraging companies to, increase their level of cybersecurity hygiene?
Yeah, that's actually excellent question, Joe. The not an issue or the thing with medical devices are they're highly regulated, and companies usually don't do anything without regulators requesting it, which is understandable because the regulators ask quite a lot from the medical device manufacturers. They are under high stress, so they have to implement a lot of requirements and in the medical device. So usually they try to minimize the effort. However, when it comes to those security levels you are referring to, medical devices, for medical device manufacturers, there is the requirement to have let me find the correct English word. There is a common responsibility, right? So the medical device manufacturer cannot say, well, I have implemented that device and it's finished, I bring it to the market, now it's up to the up to the hospital or to the operator to secure it in a way that it should be secure. So my security assurance level is that one, and the operator must do the rest. That's not possible. And this is exactly defined also in the CG guidance document. They say we have common, what is it, correct English word for it? Common, help me, Joe, common responsibility.
Yeah.
Right. So, and here you have the 6601 as a help, 6601-4-5, where you define security assurance levels for the device itself, for the operator, and also a combination of those. And this is mandatory required for medical device manufacturers. So they must do that, unfortunately. Or no, fortunately. I mean, it's quite a lot of work, I understand. However, you do not want to bring a medical device into the market just because the operator have a completely open IT infrastructure. Your device get affected and you kill the patient. At the end of the time, the legal manufacturer, you are responsible for the safety and security of the device. And you do have the common responsibility. And for when it comes to being put on court, everyone in the chain, from the economic operator to the legal manufacturer to the importer, are all common under common level who can be brought to court. So it's not only the manufacturer, also the notified body can even be brought to court if they don't do it, if they did something wrong in a chain.
Great. Right, thank you, Abtin, for a great presentation. Some great answers there. Some really good questions. Much appreciated for all the input that we've had. Just as mentioned earlier, we'll be sending you a copy of the presentation and the recording. Our next available webinar is on the 13th of July and focuses on artificial intelligence in cybersecurity. And you can go to the link shown on the slide here, to register. So certainly as well, please do get in touch with us as well if there's any webinar subjects that you haven't seen that we've covered yet, but we'd be very interested in looking into that for you. So on behalf of myself and our presenter, thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you.